This is my message for the 6th Sunday of Easter season. Today I want to talk a little bit about suffering, and I suppose this is timely because during this present epidemic, lots of people are suffering in many different ways. My inspiration, however, comes from a letter that was written nearly 2,000 years ago by one of the first followers of Jesus to some fellow followers who were suffering persecution and public ridicule. The letter was from Peter, and he makes the astounding assertion that suffering for doing good is somehow a blessing. When I first came across this idea, I thought it was really strange. Looking back now, I can see numerous ways to understand this, but I hope that sharing my initial struggle to make some sense of it might be helpful to others. The reading appointed for today from the book of Acts has the Apostle Paul speaking to the philosophers of the day on Mars Hill in Athens. His summary of how the gospel of Jesus Christ intersects with philosophy is still amazingly relevant nearly 2,000 years later. But by engaging the philosophers and explaining the reasons for his faith, Paul is just practicing what Peter recommends to all the followers of Jesus. Peter exhorts Jesus' followers to always be ready to give an account for their reasons for their hope in the Messiah. He says, "Be ready to make your defense," that means explain your reasons, "to anyone who demands from you an accounting for the hope that is in you. Yet do it with courtesy, meekness, and respect." I can only pause briefly to note how important courtesy, meekness, and respect are when we talk about what we believe. Another version says, if someone asks about your hope in Messiah, always be ready to explain it, but do this in a gentle and respectful way. So are you ready to make your defense? Are you ready to explain your hope in the Messiah and your reasons for having it? Has anyone ever asked you to explain your faith? Do you think you can do it in a gentle and respectful way? Do you have a reasonable explanation for believing what you believe? Well, perhaps there's even more than just being able to explain what we believe in the realm of ideas. There's also being able to show in the way we live that we actually do believe what we claim to believe about Jesus. We frequently hear that how we live is more important than what we say. This is true, of course, but talking and living are not mutually exclusive. What we say is part of how we live. And if you want to explain something, words are really useful. In fact, I think they were invented for that purpose. Nevertheless, I believe there also exists a deeper level of communication. It may surprise you, but I think it has to do with suffering. The way we suffer and how we understand our suffering is a powerful language. Let me try to explain that using words. 14 years ago, when I was working on the St. Aidan Church renovation, I was invited to preach on this same Sunday of the Easter season, and so I read from Peter's letter, "If you suffer for doing what is right, you are blessed." Now, how many of you feel blessed when you're suffering? We don't usually think of suffering as a blessing, do we? But Peter was writing to followers of Jesus who were experiencing persecution and public ridicule. He says, "Keep your conscience clear, so that if people speak against you, they will be ashamed when they see what a good life you live because you belong to Christ." Then, here's the next part that startled me. "For it is better to suffer for doing good, if suffering should be God's will, than to suffer for doing evil." Well, how much sense does that make? It is better to suffer for doing good? It seemed ludicrous to me. I mean, suffering for doing good just seems wrong. Doesn't that seem a bit strange to you? That suffering for doing good could be better than just getting what you deserve? I mean, we do good things because they are good things, and we want to be good people. But the idea that we might suffer for doing things, good things, just doesn't seem fair. Peter says, "It is better to suffer for doing good, if suffering should be God's will, than to suffer for doing evil." Well, let's look at the last phrase, to suffer for doing evil. I don't think this is where the problem lies. Think about it. People shouldn't be allowed to get away with doing evil, should they? When someone does evil, don't you think they should get caught? Isn't our whole justice system and police force about that? There ought to be consequences for doing bad things. So when you pay your fine for speeding through a playground zone, you are quite naturally suffering for having done something bad. Of course, if we are honest and we admit our temptations, don't we all sometimes wish we could get away with being bad once in a while? Can you remember doing something that you shouldn't have and then asking God to help you not get caught? Come on now. Have you ever gone through a speed trap and thanked God that the policeman was already busy with another speeder and didn't pull you over? I think what often happens in times like that is that our sense of relief is tingled also with a bit of guilt. It seems our God-given conscience gives us that inward recognition that when suffering comes as a result of behaving badly, we probably deserve it. We understand that there is a natural relationship between doing bad things and suffering. Some call it karma, but we all seem to know instinctively that evil and suffering go together. Now, this doesn't mean that we don't also believe in and practice forgiveness. But forgiveness has meaning precisely because, first, there is the idea that punishment is deserved. Let me say this again because there seems to be some confusion about what forgiveness really means. Forgiveness has meaning precisely because punishment is deserved. Anyway, as I struggled to grasp what Peter was saying, I realized my problem was not with the idea that we might suffer for doing evil. Most of us don't think it's terribly unfair if evil results in suffering. In fact, that suffering results from evil is just the way we think the universe should work. But let's look again at Peter's assertion. It is better to suffer for doing good, if suffering should be God's will, than to suffer for doing evil. If, as we have seen, suffering for doing evil is the natural thing to happen, how on earth could suffering for doing good be better? Wouldn't that be worse? Suffering for doing good doesn't sound fair. How could it ever be right for good people to suffer? The classic problem of pain has seen various attempts to provide what is known as a theodicy, which means an attempt to reconcile the existence of evil and pain and suffering with the existence of a loving, powerful God. You might be familiar with a book from a few years back called When Bad Things Happen to Good People by Rabbi Harold Kushner. I think Rabbi Kushner gives really good advice on talking with people who are suffering, but I do have some difficulty with his theological explanation. Rabbi Kushner attempts to solve the classic problem of why a loving God would allow suffering by suggesting that God is not really almighty. He suggests that God would like to help us with our suffering, but is just not able to do so. So even people who do good might suffer because simply God is powerless to stop it. To me, this seems a rather unusual position considering how much emphasis the Bible puts on God's power and freedom. And Peter presents quite a different angle on the problem by using the phrase, if suffering should be God's will. This means that a loving God might nevertheless allow suffering. Now, this little phrase, if suffering should be God's will, is quite a bombshell, because it contradicts a very common assumption related to the problem of pain, which presumes that a loving God would never want or will people to suffer. Now, to be fair to Peter, the Greek wording is a bit unusual and doesn't explicitly mean that we might suffer for doing good, maybe just that we might suffer when we are doing good, or perhaps even suffer in spite of doing good. But this still doesn't really help our sense of fairness, does it? Peter is not saying that suffering is always God's will, but nevertheless, although it may be unusual, at least on occasions, God might include suffering for his people. And when we think about this, it's certainly not the only place in the scriptures that presents suffering as a real possibility without ever needing to deny the love of God. The book of Job is only one example. So Peter says, it is better to suffer for doing good, if suffering should be God's will, than to suffer for doing evil. As I struggled to make sense of this, I began to make a connection between Peter's rather startling idea that we might suffer for doing good and his earlier exhortation to be ready to explain the reasons for our hope in Messiah. In the story of Paul and the philosophers in Athens, Paul frames his defense of faith and his account of his hope in philosophical terms, because he's speaking to people who are interested in philosophy. This type of presentation is important for some people, such as myself, who really want to include philosophical reasons in our understanding of the gospel. However, for many others, perhaps the most powerful reasons to hope in Jesus as the Messiah are very personal reasons. Not everyone is interested in philosophy, even though I think we all have some. So you may be far more effective in helping people understand your faith if you simply tell your personal story and your personal reasons for believing in Jesus. But whether we explain our faith in philosophical terms, or just in very personal subjective terms, there seems to be an even deeper level of communication that has to do with how we suffer. This is one of the bridges to the part that I had trouble understanding. Because more important than being just able to explain the ideas you believe in is the ability to live in ways that show you actually do believe what you claim to believe. So there's a connection between explaining our hope and suffering for doing good. And I think the connection is this. Our attitude in suffering is a manifestation of the hope that we have in Messiah Jesus. The way we suffer is an indication of the kind of hope that we have. I've heard that one of the reasons that faith in Jesus as Messiah spread so quickly through Rome and the Roman Empire was the persecution of the early Christians. Now, you might think that persecution would prevent any group from growing. Indeed, oppressive regimes and dictatorial governments still seem to believe this, but history has proven them wrong repeatedly. When you make martyrs for a cause, you often only motivate more to join that cause. And if this is true even for terrorists, it is probably especially true for pacifists. Gandhi understood this. Martin Luther King understood this. Being willing to suffer for doing good, but not retaliating or resorting to violence, not only puts you on a moral higher ground, but also shows that you have a worthwhile purpose beyond the pleasures of this moment. And so it was with those early Christians, who were willing to suffer and die for their faith, even though they had done nothing wrong other than confess Jesus as their Lord. Here's how I think it worked. There is a purposelessness that often comes with affluence. And in a decadent society like Rome, with all its entertainments and depravity, it seems many people felt there was little to be valued and little worth living for. But when they saw Jesus' followers slaughtered in the arena simply for refusing to deny their faith in Jesus, they were amazed. Those Christians apparently had found something worth dying for. And something worth dying for is certainly something worth living for. As Father Tertullian said, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. Or, if you want a modern illustration, as Obi-Wan Kenobi said, you can't win. If you strike me down, I shall become more powerful than you can possibly imagine. There are other points that could be made about the utility of suffering in our personal lives. I can mention only one more. I can remember bringing a clergy colleague back from the hospital after her back surgery. She was still in quite a bit of pain, and I think feeling socially awkward to be groaning and wincing as we drove along. I heard these words coming out of my mouth. "Thank you for allowing us to share in the sacrament of your suffering." I remember thinking that she must have thought I was a real nutcase for saying such a thing. Here she was, traveling along, in the indignity of her pain and helplessness, and I was talking about suffering as a sacrament. However, the more I reflect on this, the more I come to believe that suffering can be a means of grace. It can be a point of contact between us and God. It is a place where we can identify with the suffering of Messiah Jesus, and he can identify with us. So even if we do suffer when we are trying to do what is right and good, our suffering is not wasted. It contributes to our own spiritual growth and to the growth of the kingdom of God. Peace be with you. Amen.